Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. The Middle East has long been a volatile region, in no small part due to U.S. meddling and intervention. Currently, the region is host to 4 failed or failing states and 3 ongoing wars. One urgent question is whether a 4th war is on the horizon, this one being orchestrated by Donald Trump. To help us figure out this question, if there are any answers to questions in this age of Trump, I'm really happy to be welcoming back to Other Voices, Reese Erlich. Reese, welcome back.
Thank you so much.
Reese is an award-winning print and broadcast journalist. He's been reporting for over 40 years. He's also an accomplished author with numerous books on many of the areas you report on: Cuba, Iran, Iraq. Reese's most recent book, Inside Syria, has just been updated and re-released in paperback. And his book about Iran, a major topic of tonight, is the Iran Agenda, that was originally published in 2008. And his publisher has just asked him to update that one for reissue sometime early next year. So when that's out, we'll have you come back if there's still an Iran to talk about. So glad to have you back here. I want to start with a rather striking article by Trita Parsi, who's the executive director of the National Iranian American Council. He originally wrote this for NIAC's website, and I just see it everywhere on the web anymore. It's called "The Mask is Off, Trump is Seeking War with Iran." And let me read one particularly pungent sentence from here. They were in the Oval Office discussing the Iran nuclear accord signed with Iran, the United States, and 5 other global powers. And the United States has to certify to Congress, is it every 3 months?
Every 3 months.
Every 3 months that Iran is in compliance. And he had his national security team in the Oval Office, and they were saying Iran is in compliance, and that's what we are supposed to be reporting to Congress. This is from Trita Parsi's op-ed piece. Trump threw a tantrum in the Oval Office and berated his national security team for not having found a way to claim Iran was cheating. According to Foreign Policy, the magazine, the adults in the room, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, and National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, eventually calmed Trump down, but only on the condition that they double down on finding a way for the president to blow up the deal by October, the next time they have to verify.
Pretty incredible, huh?
Before we started taping, I made sure you had read this. I knew you had. Your reactions to this?
Well, it's a very accurate description, and it was not unique to Trita Parsi. This was all over major media over the last few days. And it's incredible because what they're saying is if we either want to go to war or certainly up our military confrontation with Iran, go out and find the reasons.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about this is that the U.S. has always done it in recent years. The Vietnam War, remember we were fighting communism and they were going to come and take over Southeast Asia, and the incident with the Tonkin Gulf proved that, and we escalated the war. Well, we now know the Tonkin Gulf incident was U.S. ships firing on U.S. ships, but it was the reason that Johnson used to escalate the war. When Reagan was getting ready to invade Grenada, he invented the concept that American medical students were in danger.
Yeah.
So that was the justification. Panama was being run by a dictatorial drug dictator who happened to be working for the CIA. You know, but that was so for each of the, and of course the famous or infamous weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In each case, they decided to go to war, and then they found the reason that would make people the most afraid, the most worried, to demonize the enemy. But they hid it.
And then announced that they were going
Right, but they hid it. They pretended it was something else.
Yeah.
Now, Trump has just stripped all that away. It's there. We're going to take military action against Iran. Go find me a reason.
Yeah.
That's what he's basically said. Now, whether that means we're going to actually go to war in the sense of a full-scale invasion and occupation, or it simply means stepping up efforts to sponsor terrorist groups inside Iran, or to sponsor other countries who might take military actions against Iran, I don't think those questions have been settled. But for sure there's some kind of increasing confrontations with Iran on the agenda.
It's also becoming more apparent in various reporting in many outlets that regime change is a goal of this administration. And
and not just in Iran, Venezuela and lots of other places around
North
the world.
Korea, I do want to make a little aside here. I was talking with my partner just a couple of days ago, and we're both struggling with using the term administration with this particular regime, because they're not really administrating anything.
Let's see, gang of idiots, incompetent boobs. I don't know, take your choice.
Yeah. The idiocracy in the White House is looking for regime change in Iran.
Yes.
And so that could come out either by funding internal turmoil of some sort or doing it ourselves.
Yeah, if you can go back to the Bush administration, Bush II, there was a very active program to sponsor terrorist groups to launch attacks in Iran, particularly in the ethnic minority areas where there are legitimate grievances against the central government. So in Baluchistan, which is the part of Iran that's near the Pakistani border, the Kurdish region up near where Turkey and Iraq and Iran all meet, and I wrote about this in Mother Jones, and I wrote about this in my book, they sponsored various, and I don't use the term terrorists lightly. These are folks who intentionally kill civilians in order to produce their right-wing goals. The U.S. had sponsored a number of these groups under Bush. That seemed to have subsided under President Obama, although he had his own ways of trying to attack Iran by stepping up sanctions, intentionally prohibiting medical supplies and food from getting to Iran and various other things. But it may be that Trump will, because he's got some of the same people who backed Bush on Iran policy, they may be planning the same now under Trump.
Let's step back so everybody is on the same page and in context here. Let's just review what the nuclear accord says, who the parties are to it, because it's not just the U.S. and Iran who have signed this deal.
Right. There's an amazing amount of misinformation about the nuclear accord in the United States, in the mainstream media, whether it be the New York Times or NPR or anybody else. And
that's why we have this program.
Absolutely, and we've got the tens of thousands of people clicking on YouTube even as we speak. What happened was Iran never had a nuclear bomb program. For sure it didn't have one starting in 2003, and that's according to the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon, everybody. Yeah. They're in agreement with that. I would argue they've never had a nuclear bomb program. But the U.S. managed to convince the people in the U.S. and in Iran and in Europe that Iran was a danger because it was only a matter of days, months, years, depending on who you listen to, from having a nuclear weapon. So they cranked up sanctions on Iran.
Now they were
producing nuclear fuel for use in nuclear power.
Yes.
Which, by the way, I disagreed with because I don't think nuclear power is a good idea within the United States and Iran.
Yeah.
But as long as the U.S. and Europeans have it, the Iranians have a right to it as well. Yes, they were producing. They were not producing weapons-grade uranium. They were not They did not have missiles, or they couldn't, let alone knowing how to miniaturize a bomb. I mean, they were even if they had decided to start making a bomb, they were many, many years away from ever having one, and they were not making one.
Yeah,
and they didn't have a program.
Uranium enrichment was still
Yeah.
had to be 5 times more to actually
Exactly.
be for bomb material.
Nevertheless, the Obama administration, together with some European countries, put a huge amount of pressure on Iran, imposed sanctions. It was hurting the economy, and the Iranians came to the conclusion that they might be able to make a deal if the U.S. would live up to it, because they didn't want a bomb to begin with. And they did want the sanctions lifted, and they did want foreign investment and trade and the banking system restored, which was probably the single biggest issue. The U.S. had cut off their ability to have access to international banking, so instead of wiring money to buy your supplies for your factory, you had to carry suitcases of cash on an airplane to that country to get it to work.
And for a petroleum exporting country,
that was a very big deal.
Particularly problematic.
Exactly. So the Iranians and the U.S. got together. There was a huge, very tough negotiations because neither side trusted each other. But they hammered out an agreement that was the most intrusive, the most comprehensive arms agreement ever negotiated, period, bar none. The Iranians would have their process for making and producing nuclear power inspected from the point of the uranium being mined, it being turned into, being processed, it being taken, it being enriched. What happened to it, the international inspectors and cameras would be there at every step of the way. They could be inspections of those sites. I mean, it was very intrusive, and frankly, many Iranians were angry at how intrusive it was, but the agreement was made, and both sides agreed to it, and in return, the U.S. agreed that it would allow Iran to produce nuclear fuel for nuclear power, not for weapons.
Mm-hmm. A lower grade.
Lower grade, and it would be thoroughly inspected. And the U.S. would lift sanctions, and the UN would lift sanctions, and the Europeans would lift sanctions related to the nuclear issue, and therefore allowing Iran to have further investments, to allow the banking to proceed normally, and so on. So each side gave up something.
And again, it's not just two sides. It's not just U.S. and Iran. Also, part of the negotiators included the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Russia.
Right, exactly. And by everybody's account, by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, by the Europeans, by the U.S. Inspector, U.S. State Department, Iran has lived up to every bit of the letter of that law, of that accord. So what Trump is saying is, I don't care. We don't like Iran. We want to go after Iran. We need a reason. So find me a reason that they're not adhering to the agreement. That's what he said.
Yeah.
And the most likely one seems to be to demand that the inspectors be able to go into Iranian military bases, which was never agreed to.
Right.
And can you imagine if Iranians demanded to go into secret American military bases and look for weapons of mass destruction, how far they would get on that?
Right.
Of course, they're not. And what's more is the U.S. knows the Iranians won't do it. What they're looking for is an excuse to make the Iranians look bad.
Yeah.
And see, they wouldn't let us on XYZ base. They must have something to hide.
So does the accord actually list places that they can inspect?
Yeah, not by name, but types of. So they can visit the uranium mines, the processing facilities, the places where the uranium is processed. The centrifuges are used to enrich the uranium. All of those kind of places are open for either direct personal inspection, or they have sealed cameras and so on that are used to inspect. Yes.
So the presumption is that the way they're going to cook up a violation or get Iran to react somehow is to say, we suspect there's nuclear research taking place at this military base, say maybe a missile base, because they don't much care for the missiles either, and insist on inspecting that, and Iran can say no under the accord, but then
it doesn't matter. The U.S. will say, aha, that shows they're doing something suspicious. And we don't have to speculate about this. In Iraq, they did exactly this. Remember, they demanded to go into the basement of Saddam Hussein's palace?
Yeah.
Because they might have new secret weapons of mass destruction in the basement?
That's where the weapons of mass destruction were.
Certainly, if I had a lot
of the pool table and the
that's where I'd want to store mine if I had some, right under where I sleep. So I mean, it's absurd, but of course you can't prove a negative. And every time, if the Iranians did agree to one, they'd say, aha, but you didn't let us into this one over here, and there's another one over here. So you can always claim, you can't prove a negative. You can always claim that something's going on, sow dissension, and use that as your excuse.
But
now the good news is the Europeans aren't going to go along with
that was going to be my question.
Sharp question. The Europeans won't go along with it because A, they know there is no violations. They actually believe their own inspectors and the atomic energy inspectors, and they've already started the process of investing money. So Total, the French oil company, is making a multi-billion-dollar investment in oil and gas. The Peugeot, the French auto company, German technology companies, a lot of folks are coming in making investments, expanding trade deals. They're buying Iranian oil, and they don't want this all disrupted because there's some nutcase in Washington, in the White House, who wants to go after Iran. So the U.S. is going to have a very difficult time trying to carry this out.
And also within the idiocracy within the White House, apparently Tillerson and I think Mattis are both supportive of the nuclear accord. They think it's a good thing. But it's really hard to make these kinds of judgments. What's your view on that?
They are, to date, they opposed decertifying, and that's a good thing. In other words, they say the Iranians are carrying this out. That doesn't mean they support the agreement. All the three key generals now in the cabinet, or the key advisors, are all anti-Iran. They all see Iran as the source of all the trouble in the Middle East. Not Israel, not Saudi Arabia, certainly not the United States. It's Iran.
Yeah.
And with that kind of thinking, it leads you to maybe a more sophisticated way to try and attack the accord, or to leave the accord in place but attack them on other issues. So a perfect example of that is this whole ballistic missiles issue. When the accord was agreed upon by both sides, the wording about what Iran could do with its ballistic missiles was changed. And one UN resolution was substituted with another. And it went from they are prohibited from developing ballistic missiles with capable of carrying a nuclear weapon, to it being advised against doing it. They're cautioned against doing it. The wording change was intentional. It went from an absolute prohibition to a concern. And the US is simply ignoring that and saying, oh, well, the old one holds, even though we agreed to the new one. And what Iran is doing so far is testing ballistic conventional missiles, missiles capable with conventional weapons.
Right.
And it's perfectly legal under the new UN resolution. And the U.S. has just passed new sanctions against Iran for a non-existent violation of the agreement.
Yeah, for a violation of...
Or sometimes they say it violates the spirit of the agreement. Well, a spirit and $2 will get you across the Bay Bridge. I mean, there is no spirit of the U.S. had no intention of changing its policies towards Iran, and Iran has no intention of changing its other policies towards the U.S. or the region. What they agreed to was to eliminate the possibility of Iran having a nuclear bomb, and that is being lived up to.
Yeah, and that accord, there's all kinds of sanctions on Iran. And some of the sanctions were specifically in response to the supposed nuclear weapons development program.
Right.
And after the accord was signed, those are the sanctions that got lifted. But other sanctions remain in place. That's right. One's on the missiles, and like you said, they just got increased by Congress.
And human rights violations,
there's human rights,
support for terrorism.
Support for terror.
I actually attended a conference, a right-wing think tank in Washington. Don't tell anybody, but I sometimes talk to the right-wingers. And they had a lawyer there who was trying to unravel all the different sanctions going back 30 years against Iran. Yeah. It was so complicated, even if they wanted to unwind them all, it wasn't clear how they would go about doing it. Because presidents had done it, and then Congress passed laws, and the presidents made it worse, and so on. So there's a long history. The difference is these are unilateral sanctions just by the United States. There's no other country in the world who is adhering to those sanctions so far, other than the ones passed by the UN.
Yeah. What did Congress just add on to this pile?
Well, they managed to combine Russia, Iran and North Korea all into one new sanctions
Yeah,
law.
we have a new access of evil.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the most troubling parts of it, and the European press has been covering this, it hasn't been covered that much in the US, is that it asserts the power of the US to go after European or other third country companies if they violate the sanctions, i.e. they do business with Iran or the prohibited areas, or same thing with North Korea or Russia. And of course the Europeans are furious about that. That came up around Cuba, when the US tried to tell the Europeans they couldn't own buildings in Cuba or trade with Cuba because the US unilateral embargo said so.
Yeah.
So you'll see in the months ahead, if once Trump signs the new sanctions, the Europeans are going to be quite angry.
Yeah, because it directly affects some deals they have in the works,
Yeah,
or,
exactly.
or have
It
been signed.
could potentially affect companies like Total or Peugeot or these other companies.
So, and it does seem like Trump is going to sign this bill from Congress, even though he doesn't want to, because it ties his hands on actually lifting sanctions against
interesting
Russia.
enough, this might be the one area that I could agree with him on. He doesn't want to, I think his inclination is not to want to sign it because it limits what the president can do.
Yeah.
Usually with the sanctions, there's actually a very good article, if your listeners want to go, there's a guy named Paul Pillar. He's a former CIA guy, and he's now at George Washington University, I think, in DC. And what he said is that sanctions will only work if there's a realistic possibility the sanctions will be lifted. Think about it.
Yeah.
Why would anybody possibly respond to the pressures of sanctions if at the end of the day you were going to keep the sanctions?
That's right.
Right? Makes no sense. But that's essentially what their Congress is doing, because once Congress passes a sanctions law, it's very difficult to get Congress to go back and undo it.
Yeah.
And we see that with Cuba. The reason there's still a U.S. unilateral embargo against trade with Cuba, or most trade with Cuba, is because Congress would have to reverse it. And so that now is going to be locked in, if assuming Trump passes it or signs it, that'll be locked into place with Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
Yeah, on Cuba, and I think that's a good example to mention, that I think a lot of people don't understand that when President Obama warmed up relations with Cuba, he couldn't really get rid of all the various sanctions and embargoes, because there were things like the Helms Amendment that Congress imposed, and they have no interest, this current Congress, in unimposing them.
Exactly.
They may be doing with Cuba.
And there was exactly one person of the Democrats that took a principled stand on this, and that was Bernie Sanders.
Uh-huh.
He was one of, I think, 3 senators who voted against it. And it specifically was because he opposed the sanctions on Iran and the fact that the president would no longer be able to reverse the sanctions should they decide to do so.
Yeah, I've had some conversations and seen some interesting discussion that normally this is the kind of thing you would not want to see Congress doing, tying the president's hands on foreign policy. But
that was the conservatives' position.
As with
only when Obama was in power.
Yeah, but as with so many other things with Trump, it just changes the equation on everything. So we have until about October to try to.
I think it would be great if there was some pressure from below, like there was on healthcare and some of these other issues, to force Trump to change on that. I think there'll be a lot of pressure from the European and Japanese and Russia and China, who all have interests in keeping the nuclear accord functioning. And if there was some grassroots efforts in the U.S., and there'll be pressure from Boeing and other U.S. corporations that want to do business, particularly with Iran, and maybe to some extent with Russia. Boeing stands to lose out big time. Because
Didn't they just sign a deal or something?
They did, but see, if the sanctions go into effect, that throws up for grabs Boeing's ability to sell planes to Iran. Airbus, the big European consortium, has already started delivering planes to Iran. The Iranians need new airplanes, and they would prefer to buy it from both the Europeans and the U.S. for political reasons as well as economic. But if the U.S. won't sell them, they'll get them all from the Airbus.
And that may be what's happening.
Yeah. So there will be a lot of pressure on the Trump administration to about whether what policy to adopt on Iran.
So let's talk about the bigger context here, because you mentioned the Iranian missile program, and that's a typical military development that you see a lot of countries have missiles, and the reason Iran is after missiles is not to blow up Los Angeles or anything, but they, as I said in the introduction, they live in a very volatile region. So let's take a quick survey of their neighbors and their major antagonists within the region. And what you mostly see is that the two major local powers there are Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they don't like each other. And a lot of this that's turmoil in the region is a result of these two behind the scenes and under the table always going at each other and working to widen their own influence. Can you just kind of talk about the Saudi-Iran relationship?
First thing to realize is that there are no good guys. Saudi Arabia, with the backing of the U.S., has invaded Yemen. It's tried to isolate Qatar illegally. It's been supporting al-Qaeda type groups in Syria and indeed throughout the region. There's certainly not good guys. The Iranians are not good guys either. I'm very much opposed to U.S. trying to impose change on Iran. But you know, Iranians have a horrible human rights record inside its own country. They have this habit of arresting Americans and holding them as hostages, claiming that they're spies or something like this. They've got troops in Syria. They've got troops in Iraq. You know, they are
fighting ISIS.
Yeah, fighting ISIS, but also fighting for Assad in Syria, for example, and fighting for the government of. They have tremendous influence in Iraq that goes beyond the fight against ISIS. So there's no good guys as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
But there certainly is a lot of competition. But we're told is the Saudis are the good guys and the Iranians are the bad guys.
Well, they gave Trump a sword and a
and a dance,
globe.
Yes, and he was probably holding hands with them as they're wont to do. And shortly after he's left, there was a palace coup, and they have a new crown prince.
Yeah.
By the way, you know, in terms of promoting democracy, I saw a wonderful photo of all the princes of Saudi Arabia. These are potentially, at least in theory, future kings. It's like a room of 150 guys.
Yeah.
Most of them quite old by now, you know, because it's a monarchy. And they have, it's like Game of Thrones or something. You know, you have all these competing factions and strange-looking creatures and whatever. And and there was a palace coup, and the former crown prince is now under house arrest in his palatial mansion, and the new guy is in, and he seems to be even more aggressive than the old one. So just as an example, we've got a war in Yemen that's gone on now for over 2 years, 2 million Yemenis displaced internally, 300,000 victims of cholera. The country is going through a horrendous crisis. Cholera is a preventable disease, but when you've got bad water systems and your electricity keeps breaking down and so on, it's spread, and your medical system has been destroyed by Saudi planes, it means the epidemic is spreading. And it was all preventable, and it's directly lays at the feet of Saudi Arabia and its allies who have invaded and occupied Yemen. Not to mention the fact that as a result of the Saudi intervention, the separatists are now much stronger, and the potential is to split the country into North and South Yemen. And al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, what's called AQAP, the folks responsible for the underwear bomber and the attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris, those very folks are allied with Saudi Arabia, our ally. They're fighting together in Yemen against the Houthis, who are backed by Iran. So it's a replay of the old days of anybody who's fighting communism is your friend.
Yeah.
So now anybody who's fighting Iran is your friend, no matter how horrible of a right-wing terrorist they might be.
And this is presented as a proxy war, but I haven't seen a whole lot of compelling evidence that Iran is heavily backing The
Yeah, it's not a proxy war. No, it was a in a very. I mean, Iran does back the Houthis, and both for sure politically and economically, and most likely with arms too. But not anywhere. There's no Iranian troops or advisors or anything like that fighting in Yemen, as there are in both Syria and Iraq, for example. So no, that's the excuse. And under the Obama administration, they admitted that. They said that the Houthis are not tools of Iran.
right.
This was a group that it's a conservative, mostly Shia, Islamic political Islamist group. There's both a political party and an armed militia, and they control roughly half the country in the northern part of the country. But they're not proxies for Iran. It's a civil war of which Saudi Arabia has intervened on one side.
Right. And in the course of that intervention, as you just talked about, have sparked what the UN has called the greatest humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. And not to mention that you mentioned hospitals being bombed by Saudi Arabia. Those weren't isolated incidents, and they are clear
Consistent policy.
They are clear war crimes.
I'll tell you something else you probably don't know. The U.S. could stop the war in Yemen tomorrow.
Well,
How?
first of all, they're refueling all the
Yeah, they're
fighters.
refueling and they're providing all the air. And the U.S. when the U.S. agreed to provide advanced fighter jets to Saudi Arabia, the Israelis were very worried. They didn't want those Saudi planes coming and attacking Israel. So under the terms of the sales of these planes, the U.S. provides all the technical staff for maintaining, fueling, and otherwise repairing those planes. They must be U.S. Employed by Boeing or U.S. contractors. They can be, for one word from the United States government, those people go home, and the whole Saudi Air Force collapses. They don't have, nor are they allowed to have, the maintenance crews that could maintain those. So if the U.S. wanted to stop that horrible cholera epidemic or the bombing of the hospitals or the other atrocities, tomorrow they could make a phone call and end the war the next day.
Yeah.
But of course they have no intention of doing that.
No, but maybe we all should be making some phone calls. Is there, it doesn't seem like there's anyone that's going to win this war, that it's just going to
Which
be...
one?
All of the
them.
one in Yemen.
All of the above.
All the above, but
The one in Yemen.
Sticking with Yemen and the humanitarian crisis there.
It doesn't appear so. Not at the moment.
Yeah.
The Houthis have held out much longer, I think, than the Saudis. Saudis expected a quick victory. And they're spending, last I saw, $1 billion a week or something. I mean, a lot of money even for the Saudis, even for the oil-rich country that it is. And they're having big budget problems. There is discontent at home, particularly among the Shia minority that lives in Saudi Arabia, which I've visited and reported on in the past. And the longer you stay in a war of occupation and you're losing, and you're spending money and you're losing troops, they've already had trouble with their allies. The United Arab Emirates have split off from them. So they're certainly not winning the war, and the longer it goes on, the more likely it is they'll lose.
And the more definite is that the Yemeni people will continue to suffer.
That's right.
Let's take a quick tack. I do want to get to our audience and get them in on this conversation, but while we're looking at this Saudi-Iran tension, conflict, the most recent thing we have is this embargo of Qatar by mostly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. And one of their demands of Qatar is to cut ties with Iran. And Qatar does have fairly close economic ties with Iran.
Politically, they don't.
Talk about that.
Yeah, this is
economic, not political.
Yeah, this is one of the weirder developments, I have to say, and I've been following developments there for a long time.
So you've seen a lot of weird.
I've seen a lot of weird stuff, and this one, Qatar, of course, is a small country, an emirate that's on the tip of the peninsula, connected to Saudi Arabia, and so they have a land border.
It's
and
a little thumb.
A little thumb, exactly, that sticks out into the Gulf, and they were all buddy-buddy. I mean, they're allies. They were supporting Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia were the three main countries supporting rebel groups in Syria against Assad and in a broad sense pro-U.S. And so you'd think, what gives? But I think the Saudis thought that Qatar was getting too big for its britches. It's a small country. It's wealthy by per capita. It's the wealthiest country in the world because they've got all these natural gas resources.
Yeah.
And they have the home for Al Jazeera, and they were starting to have a lot of political influence. Not so much in Syria, but in Libya and other parts of the world. And they tended to support the Muslim Brotherhood faction of the political Islamists, whereas Saudi Arabia tended to support the more extremist groups like the Al-Qaeda affiliates or ones similar to that. And so that's one of the big disputes. Another is, what attitude should you take towards Iran? So Saudi Arabia wants to cut off all relations with Iran. Qatar has a joint natural gas field. It's called the Pars gas field that is jointly owned and controlled with Iran. So that necessarily means they have some kind of
requires a little
yeah, they don't
cooperation.
I mean, they were fighting each other, or proxies were fighting each other in Syria and Iraq and so on. It's not like they're supporting Iranian-backed guerrillas or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just that they were not as hostile to Iran as Saudi Arabia. And then so Saudi Arabia and Egypt and UAE decided they were going to teach Qatar a lesson and basically enforce regime change. That was the goal. So they cut off economic ties, they cut off airspace, and they said, we'll see how long you last. And the Qataris went, no, we'll last a lot longer than you think. And so they're now trading more with Iran and with Turkey and other places. And they've got a lot of money, so it's not like the kind of impact that would have on
not going begging.
And they do have sea lanes. They've got money to buy stuff, and they've got sea lanes on the rest of the country that's not attached to Saudi Arabia. So far, they seem to have weathered the storm. In fact, it's produced a surge of nationalism in support of the monarchy there. That's another monarchy. And so it seems to be backfiring on Saudi Arabia. They've now got two crises that they're not doing so well, Yemen and Qatar.
So let's, for this survey and then get to the audience, on the other side of the equation is perhaps more in the Iran camp is Iraq. Talk about post-U.S. Iraq and its relationship with Iran and how that plays in the region.
Of course, the greatest irony of the Iraq War is the U.S. spent $2 trillion, lost 5,000 American lives, 100,000 plus Iraqi lives, soldiers, and probably 1 million civilians. And at the end of the war, Iran had more power in Iraq than the United States did. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Presidents Bush, Trump, and Obama. Iraq currently has a government. It's a elected Shia-dominated government that has very close relations with Iran. And of course, they have a very serious threat from the Islamic State, which is a Sunni-inspired, ultra-right-wing political Islamist group.
And again, for those who have trouble keeping this straight, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, Iran is Shia.
Exactly. Although that's not at the core of the fight.
Right.
That religion is used by both sides to justify and mobilize and rally their followers, but it's about political and economic and military power,
as it always is.
Like it is everywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And same thing, it's true in Iraq. There's certainly schisms between Sunni and Shia, but and political parties are largely based on those denominations. But it's all about who's going to have power. So it looks like the Islamic State has lost Mosul and may well lose some of the other strongholds that they had held. That's a significant defeat for the Islamic State, and I think it's a good thing for the region. Hopefully that will happen in Syria as well. But it's not by any means the end of the war. The key question is once the Islamic State is gone, who is going to come in and govern, and what kind of governance are they going to provide? Is it going to be the same old corrupt Shia political parties that made a mess of things before, or are they going to change policies and incorporate the people who had been victims of the Islamic State into the government, rebuild the country, provide jobs, et cetera, et cetera? So far, it's not looking real good. But remember, Iran is backing the Iraqi government. They fought with the Iraqi government, their militia and their troops and their advisors fought against the Islamic State. but they're also part of this corrupt Iraqi government system. They're allied with it. And they're going to be seen as partially, if things don't go well in the Sunni regions, they're going to be faulted for it.
What is the economic relationship between Iran and Iraq? I was reading something recently that manufacturing and stuff in Iraq isn't coming back because they can just buy everything from Iran.
Yeah, Iran is a big exporter to Iraq. They have a functioning economy. They have civilian industries. They have consumer industries, and Iraq basically is a one-product economy, oil. And that's true both for the northern Kurdish region and it's true for the Iraq proper. And with the crash in oil prices, now it's gone on for several years, it's caused huge budget problems. Mm-hmm. They don't have the money to rebuild their country. Yeah. They're going to have to get the money from somewhere else, and it's not clear at all who's going to do that. Iran might kick in a little bit, but they're not going to, they don't have the money nor the inclination to rebuild Iraq.
Yeah, and one of the odder ironies of all this sort of stuff that I want to report on this import-export thing between Iran and Iraq is that there's a Shia pilgrimage site in Iraq that Iranians go to a lot, and an Iraqi was quoted as saying, yes, we buy and import apples from Iran so that we can give them to Iranians when they go to this pilgrimage site.
I believe it. Yeah.
All right, let's get our audience in on this, and the way this works is you wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone, and if you would stand up and just hold your hand up so she knows who would like to ask a question or make a comment. I think we're, okay, we got to take her here. All right.
So as the Saudis sort of get, I don't know if the word is defeated, but at least lose to some extent in Yemen and also in Qatar. Do you see any sign that there could be rifts within Saudi society and perhaps even some kind of revolt there?
Yeah, there were in 2011 when the Arab Spring rocked the entire region, there were big demonstrations in Saudi Arabia. And it was not just, it was Sunni and Shia, which was very interesting because there's the same schism there that there is in other parts of the Middle East between religious groups. The government was very clever. They announced plans for massive subsidies to young people for college education, to get married, for housing, and they bought off basically a lot of the people who were protesting. And they cracked down very hard, and those who continued protesting got thrown in jail. And I wrote some articles about this, and it's also in my book, Inside Syria. But the Shia areas, which is in the east of the country, which is also where the oil fields
where the oil is.
I never gave up. And I went there. They were holding demonstrations years later, 2014. They weren't getting any publicity because they banned foreign reporters from going. I was the only foreign reporter who got in as of that time. And so to answer your question, yes, there's a lot of discontent in Saudi Arabia. People don't like the monarchy. At the same time, it's a very repressive country. Religion plays a very prominent role, and the ruling clerics are tied, have made a deal politically with the monarchy. So you're going to have to see an uprising not only against the monarchy but against the top religious leaders as well. So I'm not making any predictions that this is going to happen immediately, but the potential is there, yes.
And one of the reasons it is such a repressive society is to keep the population
absolutely
rising. Okay, over here, if you'll stand up.
Hi, yes, to follow up on the Saudi developments, one of the things I understood from a year or two ago was the Saudis cut off the ability of Iranians or Persians from going to the Hajj in Mecca. And then the latest thing I heard is the Qataris maybe, are proposing to have some type of international objective, nonpartisan control of Mecca and to, let everybody go on the Hajj. Do you have any updates on that?
Yeah,
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's important to know that Saudi Arabia has much of its international legitimacy because it's the guardian of Mecca and Medina, two of the three holiest sites in Islam. And it's supposed to be available to Muslims from anywhere in the world. It's part of the goal of a devout Muslim to have the Hajj at least once. And so for them to deny an entire nationality from being able to come was a very big deal and a big break with past precedent. And the Qataris were very wise because of their fight with Saudi Arabia lays behind it to say they're against this and there should be some body above the Saudi government that makes the decision, when of course it's the Saudi government that claims it's the keeper of the holy shrines and therefore it should be able to make the decisions. I had heard there were negotiations underway with Iran to try and change that so that they can go back to making the Hajj. Remember, Saudi Arabia makes a lot of money from religious tourism, so it's not in their interest long term to exclude a particular nationality of folks. But that's the last I've heard of it.
I see another hand out there yet. Okay. And if you would stand up. Thank you.
Yeah, just how does Israel play into any of this?
How does Israel play into this?
Clearly, they were opposed to the accord with Iran.
They on the macro level, it's they opposed the accord. They opposed any deal with Iran on the nuclear issue. They opposed any deal with Iran on anything. Israel, for a long time, has always sought to blame foreign powers for the Palestinian issue at home. So in years past, it was Jordan, where the PLO was living, and Lebanon, where the PLO was, and Iraq under Saddam Hussein. All of those governments have changed, or those threats no longer exist. So the new threat is Iran. And if only we get rid of Iran and its funding of Hezbollah, then we'll be settled. The Palestinians are no longer going to oppose us or something. I don't know what the heck but the instigation of violence will stop. As we can see, the Palestinians don't rely on any outside power. They've got legitimate grievances against the policies of the Israeli government and for a two-state solution. And it has nothing to do with Iran or what they're doing. In a broader sense, Israel meddles a lot in the foreign affairs. It's involved in the civil war in Syria against Assad and in favor of certain rebel groups. It's involved in, and it has regularly, we now know over a dozen bombing attacks on Syria directly from Israel. It killed nuclear scientists in Iran. We know they're responsible for assassinations in Iran. They provided at least some, or if not much, of the Stuxnet virus that infected the Iranian computers controlling the centrifuges that were enriching uranium, and which then spread throughout the rest of the world because you can't isolate a computer virus by itself. So the Israelis are, and finally, not finally, but another factor is they're involved in backing non-Arab countries and groups in an effort to turn them against Arabs. So their Israelis are backing Kurds, for example, in an effort to turn them against Arab neighbors. They back some Iranian minority groups with the same idea. So they're far from being the peaceful power which is only defending itself from outside attack. They're on an offensive inside and outside the country to meddle in other countries' affairs.
There have been hints in the media about a warming of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. What's your read on that?
Periodically, you hear that, and it's not only just recently, going back quite a few years, decades, there's been that off and on. Obviously, the Israelis don't see Saudi Arabia as a direct threat. That's why they allowed the U.S. to, or didn't veto the U.S. giving advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia, for example.
Just strict controls.
Strict controls, yeah. Use them against somebody else, and it's okay.
Yeah.
But don't use them against us. That was Israel's policy. I think the Israelis would like to have closer relations, and they're trying to do that by saying, look, we have a common enemy, Iran. Let's forget about these Palestinians and fight Iran together, The problem is the Saudis, on some level, recognize that without the resolution of the Palestinian issue and the creation of an independent Palestinian state living in peace with the Israelis, you're not going to resolve the issue. So they're worried about getting too close to Israel and being strongly criticized by their own population and by the rest of the Middle East.
You mentioned earlier some of the internal pressures and looking for some openings by the civilian population in Saudi Arabia. You have visited Iran a number of times. Mm-hmm. What's the state of the pro-democracy movement there? And you know, it is interesting that as we talk about these various countries, it is Iran that's the only one of many that we've mentioned, except Israel, that does have regular elections. They're tightly controlled.
Yeah,
but
they do have. I mean, it's a hybrid. It's a very strange system.
Yeah, it is.
And I've covered all the elections going back quite a few years now. They do have elections. They do have vigorous campaigns, but it's within very, very tightly controlled areas. It's as if, I don't know, the major parties were controlled by an economic elite,
and the candidates.
And they picked the candidates, and then you were free to vote for either of the candidates that these elites chose. Who knew?
Democracy is,
yeah.
Who knew democracy is so complicated?
Yeah, so except in Iran, it's economic elites along with military elites, intelligence agencies. Well, so is here. Anyway, and the religious elite. That's the big difference, because there is a clerical elite in Iran.
And they're the ones ultimately who pick the candidates.
Right, exactly. And they can not only decide that you can't run for, say, parliament, but if you do run and you've run election, when it comes time to run again, they can say you're suddenly un-Islamic. Why? Because they said so. In one case, someone ran, they got elected, and then they kicked him out of office for being un-Islamic after the case, because they hadn't read the paperwork right or something. You know. So they really do have total control over the electoral system. Nevertheless, there is a popular sentiment critical of the government. The Rouhani re-election, as I call him a centrist in the context of Iranian politics. Relative to the hardliners, there's more personal freedoms in Iran today than there was under Ahmadinejad. The economy is much better, partially because of the lifting of the sanctions, partially because of the different policies that they pursued. Ahmadinejad really wrecked the economy.
Yeah.
And of course, in 2009, there was the Green Movement and millions of Iranians demonstrating in the streets, brutal repression. It took the government 9 months to completely repress it. The two main presidential candidates at that time are still under house arrest today, along with the wife of one of them. There is the same sentiment that existed in 2009 is still there in Iran. There's not the organized efforts. It's completely illegal to have anything to do with anything like forming an independent trade union or a women's group or a political party not sanctioned by the government. But the sentiment is there. And I would not, just like with Saudi Arabia, I would not be surprised if in the future we see manifestations of that again.
Let's go back to where we started. We have just a few minutes left. We know that the next verification to Congress that Iran is in compliance with the nuclear accord is due in October. Some thoughts, if you would, on what we should be looking for over these next 3 months, and what we can be doing now outside of educating ourselves, like programs like this. I really appreciate you taking the time to help us get educated on this. What can we be doing now to try to fend this off? There is not a lot of strong pro-Iran sentiment, even in the Congress. But there is.
Yeah, I don't think there has to be pro-Iran sentiment, as long as there's anti-intervention sentiment. That's what Bernie Sanders had to say was pretty good for a mainstream politician in Washington, which was, we have no business unilaterally sanctioning Iran. It's basically, it's interfering with with them the way we're accusing the Russians of interfering with the United States. Somehow when the U.S. seeks regime change somewhere else, that's okay, but if Putin wants regime change in the United States, oh my God, that's a horrible thing. What to watch out for? All of the ways in which they may come up with to claim that Iran is no longer in compliance with the agreement. And who is saying that? Is it strictly coming out of Washington and the Trump administration, or is it coming from the IAEA, or is it coming from the Europeans? Because I think we'll see very different opinions about that.
Yeah.
And what kind of actual evidence are they coming up with, and to what extent is it simply fabricated fake news in order to justify the conclusion? So that's what you keep your eye out for. And I would love to see an anti-intervention movement rise up in this country that would oppose Trump's version. It's kind of like neocon politics on steroids. It's like Bush Jr. 10 times worse, because he's picking not just fights with individual leaders around the world. He's taking on a slew of everybody from North Korea to Iran to Venezuela, you name it, China, Russia, and he's trying to fight them all at once, and it's not going to work.
These inspections, are they international, or is it the
Yes.
IAEA?
Well, it's the IAEA, yeah.
But it's people
the
from
international community has devolved onto the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the responsibility with checking these sites and monitoring the centrifuges and so on.
And just really quickly, what sort of authorization would Trump have to go bomb Iran if he says they're in violation?
I'm Trump.
Yeah.
That's his. That would be his justification. There is none.
There's
none for going to war in Syria.
And
We're bombing Syria.
We've got to leave it there.
We do.
We
Oh,
do,
gosh.
because we're out of time. My guest has been Reese Erlich, a longtime journalist reporting from the Middle East. Inside Syria, his book is just out in paperback, updated. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Next month, another Flashpoint, North Korea. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you then. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Excellent job.
Lots of fun.
Yes, you can.